My name's Jon Levy, and my research mostly focuses on air pollution exposures in urban environments, especially spatial patterns of air pollution exposures, and then understanding the health risks of those exposures. The research I've done has looked at different sources of pollution at different spatial scales. So, for example, I've done studies looking at power plant health effects, and those looked at patterns of pollution exposure over hundreds of kilometers, even thousands of kilometers from very tall stacks. In other studies, we've looked at exposures from motor vehicles or from roadways, looking at pollutants like ultrafine particles, and there, instead of looking at hundreds or thousands of kilometers, we're looking at hundreds of meters. These are pollutants that decrease very rapidly with distance. So we've looked at power plants, we've looked at different forms of cars, diesel and gasoline, we've looked at the effects of airports, both aircraft and the traffic associated with them. One of the lines of research that I've been involved in that I think is very important for policy is dealing with the distribution of benefits. We did a study looking at power plant pollution control strategies for power plants across the United States, quantified what the health benefits of pollution control would be. Were certain populations getting more of the benefits and certain populations getting less of the benefits, and really tried to understand, could you come up with policies that were both efficient and equitable? We also looked at that for buses and control strategies for buses going around Boston. We did a study of 2 power plants in Massachusetts, which were older, so-called grandfathered power plants. These are power plants that emit much more pollution than newer power plants because they're not required to meet the same standards under the Clean Air Act. So we looked at the Salem Harbor and Brayton Point power plants and modeled what their impacts were on air pollution levels, not just in Massachusetts, but throughout the Northeast, and then quantified their contributions to public health risks, as well as, probably more importantly, the benefits that we could receive if pollution controls were put into place. So this was a study that helped to contribute to some of the regulations that came on to require these plants to reduce their emissions. Okay. The state of California, and part of, I think, their ongoing process to figure out control strategies and figure out ambient air quality standards, has involved trying to figure out what the best evidence is of the relationship between particulate matter exposure and mortality. The California Air Resources Board looked at the mortality risks from fine particulate matter to try to understand what the magnitude would be, and what their report concluded, the estimates that had been used in the past by US EPA and others may have been a little bit too low. The best estimate that the California Air Resources Board came up with was a 1% increase in mortality for every microgram per cubic meter increase in annual average PM2.5 concentrations. So, every increment of exposure, they concluded, down to fairly low levels, would be contributing to mortality risk. When we're considering near roadway exposures and near roadway health effects, some of the pollutants are different and some of the methods are different relative to some of the epidemiologic studies of PM2.5 that are in the literature. Ultrafine particles are very small particles, usually looked at in the number of particles rather than the mass of the particles, and these decrease very rapidly with distance from the roadway. Nitrogen oxide is another example of a pollutant that comes largely from motor vehicles and decreases fairly rapidly in the atmosphere because of chemical reactions. So there's a number of pollutants that are not unimportant in other settings, but in a near roadway setting become extremely important, because if you take a measurement 300, 400, 500 meters away from a major road, you'll see something very different than if you take it next to the major road. There have been many studies that have shown that living near a major road is associated with respiratory effects like asthma or cardiovascular effects. And these studies may not have pollution measurements, but the other studies that have taken measurements are supportive that living near a major road would contribute exposures, and really living within a couple hundred meters is the zone where the preponderance of those exposures would occur. one of the important things to recognize for near-source mobile exposures or exposure to traffic sources in general is that there are a lot of modifying factors. For example, if you live in a home alongside a major road and you have your windows open during the summertime, your exposure is going to be much greater than someone who has their windows closed and is running central air conditioning with a filter. So I think it's very important to know where people spend their time, how they live, to look at people who spend a lot of time outdoors near major roadways because of their jobs or because of just their daily activities. And those things really could be important in trying to characterize the health risks of traffic pollution. The magnitude of the difference in exposures between ultrafine particle levels, especially right along a major road and even in the next adjacent road, really from one block to the next can be quite significant. You know, we had a study, for example, in Mission Hill where we saw significant exposures, elevated exposures alongside the major roadways. The next block over, it was greatly diminished. So it matters greatly whether you're right along that major road or even one block in.